Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
At Westminster today, Boris Johnson promised a new golden age during his first statement to the House of Commons as Prime Minister. He repeated his commitment for the UK to leave the EU by October the 31st and said although he would work flat out to try to get a deal, the withdrawal agreement, negotiated by Theresa May, was dead. The Labour leader, Jeremy Corbyn, questioned whether Boris Johnson overestimated his abilities as Prime Minister. Here's our political editor, Laura Kunsberg.
Quite the occasion. The government more or less created overnight. A cabinet in a rush.
Good morning, Secretary of State. You looking forward to your first big meeting?
So eager to get to the table, there was almost a traffic jam in number 10.
It's just before 8 a.m. and the cabinet are already gathering for their first meeting. This is a new government that wants to show they really mean business.
Right.
And there he is, in the chair he's coveted for so long. Boris Johnson, a politician who divides, trying to pull a government, a party and a country together.
It is wonderful to see this new team assembled here, and reflecting, I think, the depth and breadth of talent in our extraordinary party.
The word's familiar already. We're a lot less used to this show of unity. Brexit the number one task.
How is the meeting, Home Secretary?
Brexiteers in plum jobs.
Oh, it's a very positive cabinet, a united cabinet. It's fully supporting the Prime Minister.
The promise to leave in less than 100 days, the task.
Well, we've had an excellent cabinet meeting, very positive, very enthusiastic, and we're all ready to go now, ready to work.
Leaving without a formal deal in place if needs be.
Very good, energised.
Yet no Prime Minister can be master of a government without mastering the Commons. He's arrived for big moments before, but never like this. Relishing making an entrance?
Statement, the Prime Minister.
Our mission is to deliver Brexit on the 31st of October for the purpose of uniting and re-energising our great United Kingdom.
He wants to leave the EU at Halloween, but wants it his way.
The way to the deal goes by way of the abolition of the backstop.
He wants to make that guarantee against a hard border in Ireland disappear. Precisely what the EU says it'll never do.
I hope that they will rethink their current refusal to make any changes.
And get used to seeing this.
These are the sceptics and doubters, my friend. They are.
Pointing the finger already.
The country is deeply worried that the new Prime Minister overestimates himself.
The dynamic between this pair, the core of our politics now.
Our country does not need arm-waving bluster, but competence, seriousness, and after a decade of divisive policies for the few, to focus for once on the interests of the many.
There'll be plenty more jousts.
We are the party of the many, and they are the party of the few. We will take this country forwards. They, Mr. Speaker, will take it backwards.
Today, Tory MPs delighted at Boris Johnson the bulldozer. Hear their roars. But much of the country might take a different view.
He wants us to drive us off the cliff edge, and he does not even know the impact of the damage it will cause.
Will he bring back any Brexit plan and put it to this House, then put it to the people?
No to that, but the allies he needs on board for now.
We need to deliver Brexit with a deal, but we must be prepared for no deal if necessary.
Not her problem anymore. Watching a different, more straightforward game today. Former colleagues in tow. Theresa May at the cricket. Able to laugh now. The movers on their way in to take her belongings out. Her successor speeding in at the back. Downing Street is firmly home for Boris Johnson now. Laura Kunsberg, BBC News, Westminster.
Well, one of Mr Johnson's first acts was to guarantee the rights of EU citizens living in the UK, but that's already caused problems within his own party, with some insisting it requires a change in the law, something Boris Johnson's team disputes. The new Prime Minister says he's also considering an Australian-style points-based immigration system, as our home editor Mark Easton explains.
With politics so volatile, many EU nationals living in the UK watch on anxiously. Today, Boris Johnson offered an unequivocal guarantee that they would be allowed to remain even in the event of a no deal. But a Conservative MP who's been campaigning on the issue is worried there are no plans to make it the law.
Some member states like Spain have already passed legislation to protect British citizens living, working, studying and retired there. But it's entirely contingent on our passing first legislation to protect their citizens.
Is it not time we took back control of our immigration policy?
Controlling immigration was one of Boris Johnson's battle cries during the Brexit referendum. In suggesting Britain might introduce an Australian-style points system for new migrants, Mr Johnson is echoing the demands of Nigel Farage, both as leader of UKIP and more recently the Brexit Party. But hold on. Australian-style points system? Haven't we heard that before?
Everyone coming to work in Britain will need the right number of points to prove that they've got something to give.
Back in 2007, Labour's immigration minister announced an Australian-style system for non-EU migrants coming to the UK. And migrant workers still need to satisfy a points system to get a visa. Once out of the European Union, the Conservatives' immigration proposals would extend those rules to all foreign nationals.
The big challenge with points-based systems is that because they're more centrally planned, the government has to know things like how many migrants the economy needs and what kind of jobs most need migrant workers. And in practice, that's actually really difficult for economists to work out.
Mr Johnson wants to sound tough and conciliatory at the same time, appealing to people on both sides of the migration debate, to those who voted for the Brexit Party and want to see cuts to immigration, and to those in business and public services who argue Britain needs a reliable source of foreign labour. What does he really think? We need to see the small print. And that's a view echoed by many who say that so far the Prime Minister's offering rhetoric on immigration policy, but little in the way of real detail. Mark Easton, BBC News.
Pledging the dawn of a new golden age, Boris Johnson has set out his priorities in office, insisting that Britain will leave the European Union on October the 31st, come what may. Declaring that no-deal preparations were beginning to be scaled up, Mr Johnson said he would never agree to the Irish backstop and demanded that the EU should come back to the table and negotiate with him on that basis. That's already been ruled out by the European Commission President, Jean-Claude Juncker, who told Mr Johnson today there will be no renegotiating of the exit agreement. Our political editor, Gary Gibbon, is with me now. Looks pretty heavy, Gary.
Well, if you were expecting a deal to emerge or the sign of one early, you will be disappointed, but you might have been a bit deranged to expect that. We've had an email from Michel Barnier that's leaked to EU ambassadors saying that Boris Johnson's language in the House of Commons today was combative. They should hold their nerve, mustn't budge on the original withdrawal agreement. I don't think number 10 would mind the word combative. I think they'll be quite happy with that. But they're hoping eventually that the EU will move. But it's interesting what tactics they're choosing. This would be a moment, a new Prime Minister coming in, dispute about what the withdrawal agreement should be like. You'd expect them, past Prime Ministers, would have jumped on a plane, hopped over to Berlin, Paris, the rest of it. Boris Johnson, I think, his tactics are going to be to sit there in Downing Street and let the papers come out on no-deal preparations and just hope that on the other side of the channel they sweat a bit. So no trips by the look of it, rushing off to Paris, Berlin, Brussels and the rest of it. He did have a phone call with Jean-Claude Juncker, the European Commission President, today, and exchanged mobile phones. The other thing mobile phone numbers, I should say. The other thing that we learned today...
That might have led to a breakthrough.
on domestic areas was that on immigration targets, obviously a key point in the referendum, a key area of contention. It looks as though the target that Theresa May had of tens of thousands, it looks like that has gone. Net migration below the tens of thousands gone. It looks like the legislation on citizens' rights, EU citizens' rights, EU citizens are over here, that legislation is probably not going to happen. Boris Johnson seems to be signalling, well, let's just carry on with the stuff that Theresa May gave us. And it also seems as though the fiscal rules, once the sort of gold standards, as it were, of this previous government, that those are under review. An awful lot is unclear and may not be clear for a while as we come towards the latter end of Boris Johnson's first full day as Prime Minister.
A removal van in Downing Street this morning. The old regime in exile at the cricket at Lord's. But yesterday, there was no normal changing of the political guard. Everyone around the table at Boris Johnson's new cabinet has pledged they will not obstruct a no-deal Brexit, won't bail out on the journey.
We are now committed, all of us, to leaving the European Union on October the 31st, or indeed earlier. No ifs, no buts.
Dissent has been ironed out of this cabinet. Boris Johnson hopes that means messages like the one he went to the Commons today to deliver will shift the European Union's stance on the withdrawal agreement.
And we've only had our new Prime Minister for 24 hours. It's absolutely amazing.
Knowing they are now faced with a British cabinet that will risk a no-deal Brexit.
I do not accept the argument that says these issues can only be solved by all or part of the UK remaining in the customs union or in the single market. The evidence is that other arrangements are perfectly possible. My team and my right honourable friend, the Secretary of State for exiting the European Union, are ready to meet and talk on this basis to the Commission or other EU colleagues whenever, wherever they're ready to do so.
The EU's negotiator, Michel Barnier, emailed EU countries saying, as suggested by Boris Johnson's rather combative speech, we have to be ready for a situation where he gives priority to the planning for no deal, partly to heap pressure on the unity of the EU 27. London, Mr Barnier said, must be told the EU isn't budging. Both sides sounded like they were waiting for the other to show signs of compromise before any talks could take place. Jeremy Corbyn said the new government was hard right.
No one underestimates this country, but the country is deeply worried that the new Prime Minister overestimates himself.
Labour, he said, would oppose no deal and any deal he negotiated.
And if he has the confidence to put that decision back to the people, we would, in those circumstances, campaign to remain.
Did anybody notice the terrible metamorphosis that took place, like the final scene of Invasion of the Body Snatchers? At last, this long-standing Eurosceptic, the right honourable gentleman, has been captured, he has been jugulated, he has been reprogrammed by his honourable friends, he has been turned now into a Remainer. It is this party that is on the side of the people who voted so overwhelmingly in 2016.
It all sounded like a dress rehearsal for a general election in which the parties are more entrenched than ever in the 2016 referendum divisions. And now, entrenched in number 10, Dominic Cummings, the mastermind behind the Vote Leave campaign, not a traditional party man, as one who worked with him in the coalition government remembers.
I certainly wouldn't use the word conservative about Dom. I mean, he's a radical, he's a bit like Michael Gove, a Maoist in some ways. He believes in progress through a process of creative destruction. There's nothing small c conservative about him.
An early election is really very likely now. I think that the reshuffle yesterday, in some senses, was a clearing of the decks for that election. And what you can see is the strategy. The strategy will be to basically see off the Brexit Party and to try and maximise the Conservative share of the Leave vote. That's the strategy. Dom Cummings is back in Downing Street. That will be his strategy. It will be Lyndon Crosby's strategy, and it will be the new Prime Minister's strategy to win a fourth term, but this time not as a modern, compassionate Conservative Party, but as a hard right, Thatcherite Conservative Party.
Brexit isn't about right or left, because you've got people who vote Labour who are Brexiteers and people who vote Conservative that are Brexiteers.
Back in the Commons, a warning from the Welsh nationalists for Boris Johnson about his political tactics.
Can he confirm to me which is his heart's desire? Leaving the European Union or retaining the United Kingdom? Because he's going to have to pick one. Do or die.
Diolch yn fawr, Mr. Speaker.
Parliament has now risen for the summer. Some Tories' spirits were cheered, not all.
I think many of us are going to go away on our summer holidays full of dread and fear about what is going to happen.
Because you think this autumn there's going to be a mighty clash between Parliament, his government, that could end in a general election?
I don't see how there can be anything other than a head-on collision.
In 6 weeks' time, this car will sweep back in through the gates of Parliament to update MPs on Brexit progress. And an autumn of even bigger political convulsions could be upon us.
Gary Gibbon reporting. Well, earlier I spoke to the Children and Families Minister, Nadeem Zahawi. I asked him what he made of the cabinet reshuffle so far.
I think what you've seen with Boris, which I think has surprised many, is the speed and precision of getting his cabinet together. I mean, many a incoming prime minister in the past or a shadow leader had butchered a reshuffle.
£4 billion promised today for education, but the tragedy for him sure is that we knew this already.
And it just demonstrates that he is basically living up to his promises.
He's only saying, I'm going to do what was promised in the last administration.
Well, look, he's only been in office for hours, and he's already delivering on that promise. That's a good place to begin.
It had all the feel of new money, and that is always the problem with incoming administrations. Is there going to be something new? You need much more money than £4 billion. How much would you like to ask him for?
As the Chief Secretary to the Treasury, Rishi Sunak, is on record this morning saying there is a 26 billion headroom. If we get a good deal from the European Union, I think you'll find the economy will continue.
But you'll be asking for a chunk of that.
Well, there is going to be a spending review in good time. There'll be more money going into children's social care and high needs and, of course, education overall, as Boris has promised.
Do you see the diversity in the cabinet as just happen chance, or this is a deliberate move by Boris Johnson to reflect the makeup of the country?
I think it demonstrates Boris's ability to bring different talents together. People who may have campaigned for Remain, Robert Buckland and Nicky Morgan and Amber Rudd, and Brexiteers.
Cabinet is still a cabinet of toffs. I mean, it's basically...
That's not true.
No, I mean, but they are people who've either been privately educated or have made a lot of money.
So the Foreign Secretary and First Minister was a grammar school boy. The Chancellor was not privately educated, a working class boy from Rochdale. The father was, as
we can pick these out, but they don't represent the majority.
Bus driver. Well, you look at who else is around the table. The thing that you can no longer, I think, say about the Conservative Party, and we saw that in the final hustings in London, that we are a party of just the privileged or toffs.
The truth is, the overhang over all this is Brexit, and you're pretty happy on a no deal if it has to happen?
No, I don't want to see a no deal. I think
you'd vote against it.
No, I wouldn't vote against it because the best way to secure...
That doesn't sound very principled. I'm against it, but I wouldn't vote against it.
No, I'm not. You have to listen to me, John. The best way to secure a good deal is to prepare for no deal, because to be able to walk away is when you then allow the interlocutors to focus their mind as to move towards a compromise position.
You're going to say that by the 31st of October it's possible to negotiate another deal?
Well, what we have to do is prepare the nation. This is what Boris and the team are determined to do, so that we are ready, if we don't achieve a deal, a fair deal for the United Kingdom and a fair deal for the EU, then we can walk away on WTO terms. But by the way, in those terms, there is still a 9-month effectively standstill, which has already been negotiated.
98 days. And in that time, you think you can negotiate a deal that's good for Britain, good for Europe, good for everybody, good for your constituents in Stratford-on-Avon. It's unreal.
What you can't do is negotiate with yourself, which is, we're having this conversation by essentially taking our own options away. What you should do is prepare the nation, if we have to be able to walk away on WTO terms. This is the first Prime Minister who truly believes in Brexit and believes yes, it's a challenge, but the advantages beyond Brexit for this country.
Now, you know better...
Let me just finish this point. With a disciplined cabinet behind that Prime Minister, they, I think, will behave differently.
Well, you know better than anybody how austerity has really hit the poorest of the poor. There's been great suffering as a result of austerity. Apparently austerity is now over, but you're going to have to do an enormous amount of rebuilding, aren't you?
And Boris is already committed to making sure that he closes that gap. He's talking about our coastal towns, Scarborough and elsewhere, where we have to, as he put it, physically bring them back into the nation.
And they will be able to share in this golden age that he's described.
I certainly think they will.
You can see this golden age?
Well, let me tell you, the moment we deliver Brexit, I believe, I came from the world of business into politics, I can tell you there's a wall of money waiting to invest in the United Kingdom, because this is the best country to put your money to invest in. That wall of money has priced in Brexit. What it hasn't priced in is a Jeremy Corbyn government.
Nadeem Zahawi, the Children's Minister, talked to me earlier.
It was the first outing in Parliament for the new Prime Minister, and he hit the ground running, metaphorically speaking. But immediately, and perhaps not surprisingly, Boris Johnson was involved in a collision, again, metaphorically. In his first statement to MPs in the top job, Mr Johnson stressed again that Britain will be leaving the European Union on the 31st of October. But his assertion that any deal with the EU must involve scrapping the Northern Ireland backstop was flatly rejected in a phone call with the European Commission President Jean-Claude Juncker this afternoon. Mr Juncker's colleague, the EU's chief negotiator Michel Barnier, went even further. It was unacceptable, he said, and combative.
Well, good morning, everybody, and it is wonderful to see this new team assembled here.
Day two for Boris Johnson, first cabinet meeting, and guess what his message was?
We are now committed, all of us, to leaving the European Union on October the 31st, or indeed earlier.
And then to another bit of history, his first statement to MPs as PM.
Our mission is to deliver Brexit on the 31st of October for the purpose of uniting and re-energising our great United Kingdom and making this country the greatest place on earth. And when I say the greatest place on earth, I'm conscious that some may accuse me of hyperbole. But it is useful to imagine the trajectory on which we could now be embarked.
He then set out his hopes for better transport, broadband, new trade deals, cleaner energy, genetically modified blight-resistant crops and battery-powered cars and planes. But Brexit was his main theme, and he said this about the so-called backstop arrangements hated by many MPs to keep open the border on the island of Ireland.
No country that values its independence and indeed its self-respect could agree to a treaty which signed away our economic independence and self-government as this backstop does. A time limit is not enough. If an agreement is to be reached, it must be clearly understood that the way to the deal goes by way of the abolition of the backstop.
So although he wants a negotiated departure from the EU, he made clear that the UK may have to leave without a deal, and it's full steam ahead with no-deal Brexit preparations.
In the 98 days that remain to us, we must turbocharge our preparations to make sure that there is as little disruption as possible to our national life. I have today instructed the Chancellor of the Duchy of Lancaster to make these preparations his top priority.
There was more on recruiting 20,000 new police officers, tougher sentences for sex offences and the introduction of a new points-based immigration system that would allow people to live and work here if they have the skills the UK needs.
There is every chance that in 2050, into it I fully intend to be around, though not necessarily in this job, we will be able to look back on this period, this extraordinary period, as the beginning of a new golden age for our United Kingdom.
Now, unsurprisingly, he didn't see gold.
No one underestimates this country, but the country is deeply worried that the new Prime Minister overestimates himself.
And on Brexit,
if he has the confidence to put that decision back to the people, we would, in those circumstances, campaign to remain.
At last, this long-standing Eurosceptic, the right honourable gentleman, has been captured, he has been jugulated, he has been reprogrammed by his honourable friends, he has been turned now into a Remainer.
So does a Johnson fan think the EU will blink and negotiate a new Brexit deal?
There's 98 days for them to come to their senses, because we get right back to the basic fact. They have a huge strategic and selfish interest in doing a deal with us.
But then Boris Johnson actually spoke with the President of the EU Commission, Jean-Claude Juncker, and Johnson repeated that if an agreement is to be reached, it must be understood that the way to a deal goes by way of the abolition of the backstop, while Juncker reiterated that the EU's position that the withdrawal agreement is the best and only agreement possible. In other words, Juncker said no to Johnson. But they did exchange mobile phone numbers just in case. The Brussels Blues, she's had a few, but today it was booze and cricket with other cabinet exiles at Lord's. Back in Downing Street there were more ministers appointed to junior posts in charge of schools, the police, environment and so on. One of the more influential Brexiters, Steve Baker, who'd hoped to be Brexit Secretary, wasn't sure what he'd be offered.
I've got no expectation.
When he came out of number 10, he wasn't happy.
I will not be serving in the cabinet.
Have you been made a minister?
Will you excuse me?
Did you have an argument with Mr Johnson?
No, I didn't have an argument with Mr Johnson.
Well, you offered something.
I don't have any comment, and I do want you to look after yourself.
Baker turned down a job because he felt he'd have more power on the back benches. So as the last Prime Minister collects her staff, Boris Johnson has had a lesson from Brussels and from his Brexiter colleague Steve Baker that he may not be able to have everything he wants. Robert Peston, News at 10.
Well, we can speak now to our Europe editor, James Mates, in Brussels tonight. And James, is there any hope that the EU will be even open to talks based on the path that Boris Johnson has set out so clearly today in Parliament?
It really doesn't look like it. I mean, you heard what Jean-Claude Juncker said there today. No sooner had Boris Johnson sat down than chief negotiator Michel Barnier was emailing the 27 other EU ambassadors here and saying eliminating the backstop is, of course, unacceptable and not within the mandate given to me by the European Council. And he went on to describe the speech as rather combative. In some ways, it's making it easier for the EU27 here, in that if what Britain was looking for now were tweaks to the backstop, maybe something about the duration of it, well, it is possible that there could have been pressure on EU unity when faced with a no deal, maybe even pressure on Dublin. But given that the demand has now transformed into getting rid of the backstop altogether, well, that's straightforward. That is simply not going to be on the table, which is why people here are coming to the conclusion when you talk to them that what they're looking at here is some talks that are being set up to fail, so that at some stage, if no deal happens, Boris Johnson can blame it on a Brussels refusal to talk, and if that leads to a general election, possibly even run against Brussels in that election. So that's the feeling here. Whether this all comes to a head in August or after the holidays in September, well, Jean-Claude Juncker and Michel Barnier both said, look, we are completely available to talk during August if you want to. When the showdown comes, we will have to see, but it does look as if it's going to be a pretty busy and probably rather fractious summer.
I think we can safely say that. James, thank you very much indeed for that. So, Mr Johnson has made clearer than ever his determination to take the UK out of the EU on the 31st of October. There are 98 days to go, as he pointed out, which he says he will use to turbocharge preparations to ensure as little disruption as possible should we end up leaving without that deal. But from tonight and for the next 40 days, MPs are on holiday.
Outside Parliament tonight, Labour supporters were singing a familiar tune, but their leader seems to be changing key on Brexit.
We'll challenge them over there in the House of Commons. We'll force it to votes over there. But in reality, the vote we need is a vote of the people, both to reject Brexit and to elect a Labour government for the future.
Reject Brexit, the new Liberal Democrat leader's mission too.
We do need to stop him. We need to stop Brexit, because Brexit is bad for our country, and the way in which Boris Johnson has assembled his cabinet, frankly, is quite a worrying picture for our country.
While rebel Tories remain, well, rebellious.
Would you be prepared to vote against your own government, effectively to bring the government down to avoid no deal?
Most reluctantly, yes, and I've made this clear on a number of occasions, and so it doesn't change anything that he's relentlessly optimistic about leaving on the 31st of October. It can't do.
To get anything done, Mr Johnson faces a race against the clock. On August the 1st, there's the Brecon and Radnorshire by-election, which if the Tories lose will cut his majority to just 2. 3 weeks later, he makes his debut as Prime Minister on the world stage at the G7 in France, meeting President Trump. MPs return on September the 3rd, with only about 25 sitting days left before October the 31st, the date we're currently set to leave the EU. Any new deal, if it can be reached, would mean several days of debate in Parliament. Even no deal would require some legislation, not least to re-establish direct rule in Northern Ireland.
To be able to respond in the way they need those powers, and they need to legislate for them here in Westminster.
And that would have to be done before the 31st of October?
Well, I think any responsible government, considering the impact of what could happen in Northern Ireland, would want those powers ready to be able to use them on day one.
MPs heading off for the summer had mixed views as to whether an election might be the only way to break the logjam.
I don't think it will be necessary to have a general election to deliver Brexit.
Oh, we are absolutely prepared. In fact, I think, Professor, we would relish an election.
By the time they return in September, we'll know whether the new Prime Minister relishes the idea too. Libby Wiener, News at 10, Westminster.
And Robert is here, of course, to take us through it. So after today's speech, do you think that Boris Johnson's strategy is this big showdown, talks set up to fail, as James described them, that he knows will end in a general election?
Well, I mean, James is absolutely right that over in Brussels, that is what they believe, that they're being played in that way. But what I would say is this. I spoke a lot yesterday about the appointment of Dominic Cummings as his effective chief executive, which I regard as the most important appointment that he's made. Dominic Cummings ran the Vote Leave campaign, which carried the day, got the British people to vote for Brexit. Now, Dominic Cummings is opposed to a no-deal Brexit. He knows that it would be economically damaging. So my presumption is that Dominic Cummings has some cunning plan to avoid it. But, I mean, frankly, I don't see what it is. And, you know, if I work through the likely scenario, it is that there will be a complete impasse between Boris Johnson and the rest of the EU. At that point, we will be heading for a no-deal Brexit, talking to Tory MPs who don't want a no-deal Brexit, actually also talking to the other opposition party leaders. I think they will find a way to stop a no-deal Brexit, and at that point Boris Johnson really only has the choice of calling a general election and campaigning to ask the British people for a mandate to take us out without a deal, which he probably thinks, given that the Labour Party is somewhat divided on Brexit at the moment, that he could win. But it's high risk, and as I said, my only reason for slightly doubting that that's where we're heading is because Cummings himself, I know, doesn't really want a no-deal Brexit.
Talk to us about this other little mini-event we had this evening, Steve Baker's refusal to take this job. I mean, that was a bit of a bump in the road this evening, wasn't it?
Well, it was in the sense that, you know, Steve Baker, along with Jacob Rees-Mogg and one or two others, is really, you know, the most influential of the Brexiters on the back benches who undermined Theresa May and actually ushered in Boris Johnson. So Steve Baker definitely feels that Boris Johnson slightly owes him. He also feels he's sort of quite qualified to advise on Brexit. Frankly, he expected to be made Brexit, or hoped, I don't know if he expected, but he hoped to be made Brexit Secretary. He felt today that the job he was offered would give him less power than being on the back benches. Now, what does that mean? It means he's put Boris Johnson on warning that actually, if he doesn't look as though he's going to deliver on Brexit on the 31st of October, he'll get trouble from Brexiters like Baker.
OK, Robert, thank you.
On his first full day as Prime Minister, the aftershocks of Boris Johnson's cabinet revolution are still eddying through Westminster. One very senior Tory told me this is not about Brexit, it's not about policy, this is a personality movement. So maybe the demand of loyalty to Boris Johnson above all else is the only way he believes he can achieve cabinet unity and drive through Brexit. Hence, perhaps the dismissal without a backward glance of the Defence Secretary, for she was a Hunt supporter. And today, in characteristic form in the Commons, the new Prime Minister promised the earth literally clean and green, also prosperous, united, confident and ambitious. But the all-important detail on how and at what cost was perhaps unsurprisingly absent. However, he suffered his first rebuff today too from EU Commission President Jean-Claude Juncker, who made it clear there is no other Brexit deal. Here's our political editor, Nick Watt.
Liberated to savour an English summer's day. Unleashed to deliver an unequivocal Brexit pledge, out on the 31st of October, come what may.
I and all ministers are committed to leaving on this date, whatever the circumstances, and to do otherwise would cause a catastrophic loss of confidence in our political system.
To Labour, a no-deal Brexit is on the horizon.
If the Prime Minister continues to pursue a reckless no deal, does he accept that he would be directly flouting the expressed will of this Parliament? Industry, business and unions have been absolutely clear about the threat that it poses.
This afternoon, the Prime Minister was given short shrift by the EU. The two sides now eyeball each other. Boris Johnson insists the withdrawal agreement must be amended to remove the Northern Ireland backstop. Jean-Claude Juncker says the backstop must stay until new technology can guarantee a soft border in Northern Ireland.
What I can say is that the position of the European Union and the position of Ireland has not changed. The backstop is an integral part of the withdrawal agreement. Without the backstop, there is no withdrawal agreement, there's no transition phase, there's no implementation phase, and there'll be no free trade agreement until all those matters are resolved.
In the summer heat, Westminster is winding down for the holidays. But one minister had a pithy analysis of the standoff with Brussels. We're heading to a no-deal Brexit and a general election. Bring on a showdown with the EU, say the Prime Minister's supporters.
Backstop has to go, and if you don't, we are not messing about. If you don't take the backstop out, we are leaving on the 31st of October with no deal. Now take that, because we mean it. And I'm very sure that, we'll either leave with no deal on the 31st of October, but as somebody who doesn't want no deal, as somebody who wants a good deal, as Boris does, as most of us do, I'm hoping that the EU will realise now that we mean it, we mean business, and they will come back with a deal that removes that backstop.
And tonight, the Prime Minister pressed on with the removal of ministers opposed to no deal. There's space for the like-minded.
Do you think this will be a fruitful and friendly encounter?
I hope so, because I'm going in through the front door rather than the back door.
Indeed. And can I just ask you, what do you think of this reshuffle? Some are saying it's been a real bloodbath. Others are saying, no, this is unity and a firm smack of authority.
Well, the top priority that the Prime Minister set out multiple times is that we will leave on the October the 31st. He's got to make sure he's got the people he believes who are best to help him deliver that in his cabinet than in his ministers.
God's trying to tell you something?
It's raining, but it's been a very hot day, and I'm very pleased to have been to see the Prime Minister, and he's asked me to continue as an Education Minister, so I'm very pleased indeed.
Other priorities for former Cabinet Ministers who've pledged to block no deal. Don't write us off, their group says.
The arrival of the new Prime Minister hasn't changed anything. As my own analysis, done the best I can, is that leaving with no deal is going to be uniquely damaging for the country. I must therefore work with colleagues to try to prevent such an occurrence happening. Now, it may be that because of the Prime Minister's negotiations, this doesn't arise. But as he keeps on saying that it might arise, I've therefore got to make it my business to try to make sure it doesn't happen.
The opponents of no deal are far from united.
We've tried before and not succeeded. When I brought my amendment during the indicative votes to make revoke rather than default rather than no deal, the default option, the Labour Party failed to whip. If they had whipped, a lot of Labour MPs voted for it, but if Labour had whipped, that would have come out top of the pile. So it will mean the Labour Party getting its act together and also backbench Tories getting their act together.
Calm in Downing Street, but this is a new Prime Minister in full campaign mode.
Well, campaigning for what? Nick Watt is here. Nick, first of all, what about the first EU encounter of his prime ministerial career?
Well, I think it would be fair to say it was not exactly a meeting of minds when Boris Johnson and Jean-Claude Juncker spoke. The Prime Minister was very clear. He said the withdrawal agreement's got to be seriously amended and the Northern Ireland backstop's got to go. And the European Commission President's view is, well, we'd love not to use the backstop, but until we're sure that there's technology that can really work to guarantee that there's no hard border, then the backstop must stay. Now, I would imagine that Angela Merkel, who really wants to avoid a rupture between the EU and the UK, she won't like this, but she is going to stand by Ireland. And I was speaking to one minister who said that the Taoiseach is not going to give ground on the backstop, full stop. And this minister, who is a Brexiteer, says that they see no basis for a negotiation between Boris Johnson and the European Union.
Right, so let's fast forward, perhaps not quite as far as the 31st of October, and tell me about all the talk about an election.
There is a whiff of an election in the air. I was speaking to one member of the cabinet who said that they could see an election happening in one of two scenarios. Scenario number one is the Prime Minister gets a bad no deal and an election is forced on him by Parliament. Scenario number two is he gets a good no deal and he decides to go out there and sort of vanquish all his opponents. This minister said, unlikely to have an election for the 31st of October because, hey, you might get a deal up to that point. But other Tories are saying that if it is looking difficult and Parliament is pushing the Prime Minister, then maybe he could try for an election before the 31st of October and say, I am the only one who can deliver Brexit, no deal Brexit, make that very clearly and hope that that beats Nigel Farage.
Thanks very much indeed, Nick. Well, so if this is now a cabinet of true Boris Johnson believers, the group who take credit for the new Prime Minister, the ERG, some say rather than a group, a party within a party, now have their top man in the cabinet. Jacob Rees-Mogg is the new leader of the House. And one of his lieutenants is Mark Francois. He's with me now. Good evening to you.
Good evening.
We'll come on to talking about election in a moment. But first of all, are you disappointed not to be rewarded by Boris for all your hard work and getting him where he is today?
Who, me?
Yes, you.
No, look, what matters to me is that we leave the European Union on the 31st of October. That's what really motivates me.
But you loved being Defence Minister. I know you did.
Well, I did, but I had a good go. So I'm probably more used to the wider cause outside the tent peeing in. So, realistically. So, but what is very important is that Boris has absolutely committed that we leave on the 31st of October. With regard to the withdrawal agreement, Boris said many times on the campaign trail it was dead. He was crystal clear about it. If there were any attempt to revive the withdrawal agreement, even without the backstop, the ERG would vote against it.
No, hang on. Any attempt to revive the withdrawal agreement without the backstop, you would still vote against it?
Yes, because it's got things like...
So you're holding Boris Johnson's feet to the fire already?
He said many times during the campaign the withdrawal agreement is dead. I believe him.
So... let's look at what Boris Johnson also said. And he said the chance of leaving on the 31st of October without a deal is 1,000,000 to 1. Is that the odds that you would say?
No, not at all. I think the best way now, the withdrawal agreement is dead. Even if you tried to revive it, you then have to have a bill to ratify it, the so-called Wade Bill, and that's 5 weeks of parliamentary trench warfare with wrecking amendments. It'd be a disaster. So now hang on. So the best thing you do is you say it's dead, which he said multiple times, and you cut to the chase and start negotiating a free trade deal.
But if Boris Johnson says, as he is saying, no negotiation of the backstop, it's over, there is no backstop, and you're saying that no backstop...
Well, there's no withdrawal agreement.
Then then you're going to vote. There'll be no question of any fudge. You would vote against. I would say to you, is the policy not truly now no deal?
Well, the preferred option is a free trade agreement, which, remember, is what we were offered 18 months ago. But no, let me explain it, because it's really important. You know, remember, we were offered that by Tusk 18 months ago, but the then Prime Minister rejected it. So, in summary, no deal is still better than a bad deal, but a free trade deal is better than both. And the best possible policy is to go straight to the so-called future relationship and start negotiating the free trade deal now.
The EU has been perfectly clear. There'll be no discussion on future trade agreements until the withdrawal deal goes through. That's it.
Well, that might be their choice, but I believe they'll blink.
So, in essence, the default policy will just simply have to be no deal.
Well, I think we should aim enthusiastically for a free trade agreement, but if they don't want to negotiate one in time, then yes, we should leave on WTO terms.
Now, we know that Boris Johnson, he's not made people in Cabinet take an oath, but their loyalty is to Boris Johnson, whatever he says goes. What if he reneged the pressure of being a Prime Minister, the possibility being held out that there might be something beyond the 31st of October which would bring the country together again and see us leaving the European Union? Are you really saying he would not, in order to, for the good of the country rather than the good of the Brexiteers, do something that might delay? He might renege. No. He's got a full cabinet behind him.
No, for the good of the country and for democracy, we have to leave at Halloween. And he had a meeting with the steering committee of the RG, the top table, if you like. Now, hang on, we put him through his paces for an hour, and at the end of it, I'm the one who said, Boris, are you saying, and everybody sort of went like that if you become the Prime Minister, we leave at Halloween, come hell or high water? And he said unequivocally yes. I believe him.
But, this is all about, and you talk about the fact that, everybody's been talking about negotiating positions. Take a hard position, never take no deal off the table because it's a negotiation position. So therefore, why can't the EU be exactly the same? So the EU says that there's absolutely nothing that will change. You're not going to have anything beyond...
Well, forgive me, Herr Juncker in the bunker would say that, wouldn't he? Look, in Parliament...
You would say, Boris Johnson, the dude, would say that too.
Well, the EU for 3 years have been rolling us over because we never really argued back. We had a chief negotiator, Ollie Robbins, who was chiefly negotiating for them. We didn't stand up for ourselves. What is different is that you now have a Prime Minister who believes in leaving, who didn't vote Remain, and who is prepared to stand up robustly for the interests of the United Kingdom. That is a sea change from what the EU were used to.
But you don't have a Parliament that believes in leaving with a no deal. You also know the maths. You know you've got a by-election next Thursday. The distinct possibility, won't get as far as the 31st of October. And actually, it's not such a bad thing for Boris Johnson to have an election. You wouldn't be against an election, would you?
Well, look, for a while I was the operations officer of the Whip's office, so I know a little bit about the maths. And what's interesting in Parliament is that party positions are hardening. So Boris has been absolutely clear, we leave with no deal.
You heard Dominic Grieve?
Well, OK, but he's not the Prime Minister. Now, we've now got Jeremy Corbyn, who said today very clearly Labour, if there was a second referendum, would vote for Remain. They're now a Remain party. Jo Swinson, the new leader of the Liberal Democrats, said incredibly the other day that she wants a second referendum, but even if we had one and we voted to leave, she wouldn't accept it. Ludicrous position, neither Liberal nor Democrat. So, when you look at the maths, what you'd need to stop it is an act of Parliament. Wait a minute. The so-called Cooper Bowles-Letwin went through by one vote, but that's now expired. That was before the European elections. I believe the maths in Parliament are far more complex than many people appreciate. And there's also many Labour MPs, who never accept a Remain position. So I actually think they can't get what they want in Parliament, and I don't think they could get through a bill to stop a WTO exit.
Would you be prepared to sacrifice Scotland to leave the European Union?
There's no need to. And there's certainly no need to sacrifice Northern Ireland.
Would you be prepared to sacrifice Scotland? So there's no need to.
No, I'm sorry. The SNP position is ridiculous. We had a referendum in Britain in 2014 on in Scotland, on whether or not Scotland should leave the EU. The Scottish people voted emphatically to remain in the United Kingdom.
Thank you very much indeed.